Hey, this is Andrew Brown from Exam Pro, and in this follow along, we're going to take a look at a variety of ways that we can expose our pods via Kubernetes service. And we're going to continue on using the environments we set up earlier in other follow alongs in our Cloud9 environment. And just looking at the costs here, we're only at $3, so we're doing pretty good for this account here. But what I'm going to do is make my way over to Cloud9. So just type in Cloud9 at the top here. And if you turned off, not terminated, but turned off those environments, shut them down, they should still be here. And so we have that K8 environment with both kind and minikube and then micro K8's environment. I'm preferring the micro K8's environment, so I'm going to go ahead and open that one up just because I'm finding that one to be pretty easy to use. And we'll just give a moment for this to launch here, okay? All right, so our environment has launched here. I'm just waiting for our terminal to appear. There we are. Everything is nice and big. And so we had deployed something prior. So micro K8s is really great because if you had something running prior and you shut it down and start the machine up, it should still remain. So I'm going to type in micro K8, K8s Kubernetes or kubectl, and we're going to say get pods. And it would be really nice to use kubectl directly. I tried looking up the solution for it. It has to do something with the config file, but I couldn't figure it out. So I'm just going to keep typing micro K8's kubectl. It's not a big deal for me. And so there's that Sinatra application, and it should end up deploying. So there we go. So now it's running again, so we don't have to worry about deploying that Sinatra app again. I'm going to see what services. I don't think we have any, but we'll just double check. So I'm going to type in kubectl get services. You can also type in SVC, which is the shortcut, but I'm going to stick to typing things full out here. But on the exam, you might actually see initializations, which is kind of frustrating because they really should just always use the full names for people learning. But here you can see that we do have a service here, which is for Kubernetes, and it's a cluster IP. This is the system one that always shows up here. So we're not going to touch this one, but just showing you that it does exist. And before we actually even go ahead and launch a service, let's talk about pod communication. So if we go back here and type in get pods, we should see all the pods that are running. And so we only have one, which is Sinatra, but this actually has an IP address. And so what we can do is type in O, which stands for output, -O, which is a flag, and type the word wide, and we'll get additional information. So here we can get the IP address. There's the node that it is running on, things like that. So every time a pod is terminated or stopped or whatever, it will have a new IP address. And because dynamic IP addresses make it really hard to make microservices, because if your IP addresses are changing all the time, it's going to be really hard to communicate. And so that's the purpose of services, is that it can have a static IP. That's one reason to have it. But let's kind of observe what happens if we were to terminate this pod, okay? So what I'll do is I will copy the name of the pod here, and we will put in micro K8s kubectl, and I'm going to say delete pod Sinatra, okay? And what we'll do is just go to the top here, and I want the wide, and notice that even though the pod is destroyed, because there's a deployment, it's going to always launch a new one because it expects there to be one pod. But notice that we have a new IP address, so it's not the same one. The old one was 10.1.22.9, the new one's 10.1.22.13. So that's an example of that dynamicism happening there. Now, if we wanted to communicate with that, like right now, the IP address is here, but we are not within the node. And so if we were to try to type in, if we go up here for a second, and we were to try to take this IP address, and we were to write something like curl localhost 8080, okay, it says connection refused because, you know, these are internal traffic within the cluster, and we're not inside the cluster. So how could we communicate that without a service? So one thing that we could do is we could basically remote login into a pod, and that's something that you can do in Kubernetes. And so one thing we can do is launch a new pod. And so what I'm going to do is just type in service debugging Kubernetes, because the commands that we want are there. And so if I pull up the documentation here, they have a couple commands. So we have this one where it says, if you want to run a pod, you can run this one called Busybox. And if you've never heard of Busybox, we do cover it in the course, and we might have already covered it before this tutorial. But Busybox is basically it's a container, and it already contains a bunch of utility libraries that we can use, right? And so it's just a really easy way to get started. So if we go back over here and we look at this, what it's doing is saying, create a new pod, never ever restart this. So if we terminate, if we exit the command line, it will, or the shell, it will delete, and use the image from here. So it's on the Google's container repository here called Busybox, and it's going to launch bash so we can interact with it. So what I'll do is go ahead and copy this. We'll go back here and we'll type in clear, and we will launch that. And so what it will do is we'll launch up a new pod. Oh, sorry, we got to type in micro K8s in the front here, but it's going to launch up a new pod, and it's going to enter us into bash. And so if we go over here, we can now type in micro K8s. If you don't have a new tab, just go here and open a new one here, and we'll type in kubectl get pods, and so we can see Busybox is running. All right, and we could have written our own deployment file or pod file in order to provision it. It's just a lot easier to just write it at this one line, because as soon as we terminate this, it's going to, whoops, we'll type exit. It will then kill the pod. We don't have to worry about it. So if I go back to here, okay, see the pod is gone, but what I'll do is go hit up on my keyboard to bring back that command, and it's going to enter us back, not just launch the pod, but enter us into the pod so we can execute commands. So we are within a pod, and so technically pods can talk to other pods because now we're inside the cluster. And so if we were to type in, let's say the other one runs on 456. So if we typed in localhost 4567, let's see if that works. Okay, so we'll say localhost 4567, and we will do curl here. And so, oh, curl's not on here, so we'd have to type in wget. Okay, so wget. And that same thing as curl. And so it says connection confused. Because remember, pods communicate, containers within a pod all communicate on localhost, but pods have their own IP address. So let's go back here and type in wide, and we can see there's an IP address here. So if we were to copy this IP address, okay, paste it in here, put wget in the front, and then do 8080. 4567, right? 4567. It's able to access that index HTML. So if I just do ls, which lists out all the files, there it is. And we'll check the contents of it by typing cat index HTML. And there it is. So we were able from one pod to communicate with another pod by using its dynamic IP address. Okay. But if we kill that pod or it gets replaced, that IP address is going to change, and that's where that pain comes from. So that is what I want to show you with pods. So next we'll move on to our first service, which will be cluster IP, okay?